Hello Flosstube, my name is Ros Clark. I YouTube on this channel, Ros Clark Craft. I'm also on Instagram as Ros Clark Craft, or if you're on Ravelry as Ros Clark Craft. I normally do videos about a whole wide range of crafting things. I do dressmaking, knitting, crochet, embroidery, all kinds of things, including a little bit of cross stitch, but I've never really thought of them as Flosstube videos because they're not focused primarily on cross stitch. However, I'm about to start a new project, which is a proper cross stitch project, and I wanted to do a series of videos focusing on that. So this is my Flosstube series, if you like. I have done cross stitch for many years, on and off, it has to be said, and it had been off for a little while, and then I started again earlier this year. I made a few little Easter ornaments for a friend and various things for myself, and then started watching Flosstube, and suddenly it's become a bigger part of my crafting repertoire than it had been for some time. Where I'm at the moment, and the reason why I wanted to do this special sort of Flosstube series is I wanted to introduce you to Carmen. So this is Carmen. If you saw, I did do a video, and I will try and remember to put a link to it, back in September, for Sampler September. I did a little show off of all the samplers that I own. There's one that I've stitched, and there are 3 antique samplers, 2 of which are unfinished and 1 that is a finished sampler. This is one of the unfinished samplers, and yet if you look at it, it's hard to see that. And I must admit, I bought it as an unfinished sampler, and when it arrived, I was like, I mean, that looks finished to me. It's not finished. Right at the bottom, you can see where our stitcher has put her name and her age, and she has not completed the word years. And I suspect that along this very bottom row, she also would have intended to put a date and perhaps a location. But it is almost finished. Carmen stitched her sampler on 32 count linen. She stitched it mostly over 2. Only this little bit at the bottom with her name and age is stitched over 1. She used a few specialty stitches. So there's an alphabet here that's stitched in 4-sided stitch, and there's an alphabet here that is stitched in an eyelet stitch. There's also in the borders a little bit of satin stitch in one of the borders, which now is, maybe there isn't, maybe I made that up. Okay, anyway, there are some little specialty stitches. There's some beautiful hemming of the fabric. So it's got selvage on this side. I think that's right, yes. And this one is over stitched, but then at the top and the bottom, she's done some lovely hemming stitches. She's a really sweet sampler, I think. One of the things that really appeals to me is that other than in this lowercase alphabet, all her alphabets are mixed up with colours. She was a bit like me. She got bored of colours and she just wanted to use all of the colours. So usually you get 2 letters in one colour and then 2 in another. With the numbers, you sometimes get 2, or you sometimes get 1 number, and then she moves on. The borders tend to be just 1 or 2 colours repeating. It's a really sweet square sampler. So why do I want to introduce you to Carmen? Because I'm going to stitch Carmen. I have charted her, or at least I've charted most of her. I haven't yet, have I charted? I can't remember now. I did the charting a little while ago. I can't remember if I did the 1/1 charting. I don't think I did, and I haven't charted the hem patterns yet. But I've charted her, and I plan to stitch her. And I'd love it if you would like to stitch her as well. So this is what I'm going to do. I have, as I say, got her charted. I have got kitted up. I am going to start working this week on Carmen. And what I plan to do is, as I go through, I'm going to release the pattern each section after I've worked it, and you can see what the sections will be. They will be divided by the border. So the first bit I will do will probably go down to here and include this border, and then we'll have another section maybe going down to here and including this border, then this big alphabet, maybe stopping as far as this border, and then the last section. So I think that'll be it, probably in 4 sections, roughly even amounts of work. And as I say, I will make sure I have stitched through the chart for each of those sections before it's released, so that you'll know that it does work. It'll be a free pattern. I'm not going to charge anyone else for Carmen's creativity and her work. But I just thought other people might like to stitch this as well. I think it's a really lovely, pretty sampler. It's a really nice size. So on 32 count, which is what Carmen has used and I plan to use, it works out as just under 12 inches square. It's 11 3/4 in one direction, 11 1/2 in the other direction. So it's just under 12 inches square on 32 count. That means that even if you wanted to do a slightly smaller count, so you might want to do a 30 count or a 28 count, it's still not going to be an enormous sampler. And if you wanted to, if you were crazy and wanted to and do it on 36 count or even a 40 count, you'd get a smaller sampler, but it would still be a nice size, I think. I've worked out all the dimensions and I will put them all in the description below and also in the blog post that's going to go along with this, which will be where I will release all the sections of the chart. So it's a nice size sampler. It uses nice amount of colours, I think. It's not, you could stitch this all in one colour and make it a really nice black work sampler or red work sampler if you wanted to. But I want to do it like Carmen with all the colours. So it's quite difficult to tell exactly what colours she used because obviously it is very, very faded. Some of the stitching is damaged, but even where it's not, you can see the fabric itself has got some stains on it, and the colours of the threads are very faded in some places. It's hard to make out. It's never been framed, and so you can't just turn it over and say, oh, that's what it's using. It looks basically the same on the back as it does on the front. There is one stitch for 5 stitches that I think may have been put in later. And if you can see right here, there is, let me just bring this up really close, that red dot. That thread is not found anywhere else on the sampler. And I think it just looks so bright and new. So either it was a thread that she found that had some newfangled chemical dye and she only had a little slip of it and she just wanted to try it. More likely, I think somebody's added it later. Otherwise, this row does finish quite a lot further in. All the other rows finish right about here, and that row would finish in here. So I wonder if that's been added later, to be honest. And I've not used that as I've thought about colours. What I have tried to do as I've thought about colours is think about what it might have looked like when Carmen stitched it. And so I've looked to see what sorts of colours has she used. There's a darker blue and a paler blue. There's what appears to be at this point a sort of brownish red. Maybe that was a darker red. There's a paler pink. There's something that's more like a peachy pink. There's a yellow. There's possibly something that might have been green once upon a time. Something that might have been purple once upon a time. So I've tried to look and see how many colours do I think she's used and what sort of colours might they have been before they faded. So I'm not trying to reproduce this as it is now. I think it's quite ugly as it is. It's got a lovely antique charm to it, but I think it does, for me, I don't really like it as it is now. I would not choose to stitch something where some of the colours are so faded you can't really make out their letters, where some of the colours are faded and they don't quite work together, I think, as faded colours. I don't think this, how it looks now, is how Carmen meant it to look when she stitched it. I don't think it is how it did look when she stitched it. So what I'm more interested in is producing something that might be closer to the way it was when she stitched it than this antique sampler is now. Now obviously if you want to stitch it, you're very welcome to stitch it in any colours you like. If you want to try and stitch it, I'll put some close-up photos to reproduce the colours as it is now. You're very welcome. If you want to dye your fabric so it's got these kind of antique sort of stains on it, you're very welcome. I am not going to do that. I'm going to try and stitch it how I think Carmen might have wanted it to be stitched. So in order to do that, I have thought about what fabric I'm going to use and what threads I'm going to use. So look at me all prepared. This is the fabric I'm going to use. It is a 32 count linen, just like Carmen used. This is Zweigart Antique Ivory. When it came, I ordered it from Lakeside Needlecraft. When it came, it's a little bit darker than I was expecting. But the more I think about it, the more I think, actually, that's probably not far off the colour of the fabric that Carmen might have stitched hers on. It's, you know, though she wouldn't have stitched it on a sort of bleached white linen, I don't think, or even what we think of as an off-white linen. I suspect this is quite an old sampler. I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute, the history of the sampler. But I suspect it might have been something around that sort of colour, maybe a little bit grayer. It's hard to know exactly, but I'm happy with this. So this is Zweigart 32 count antique linen. You could stitch Carmen on aida. You could stitch her on 16 count aida, or indeed a different count, as we talked about, if you want a different size finished piece. There is only this little bit of 1/1 at the bottom where she's signed her name and her age, and I have some suggestions of what you might do if you were doing this on aida and you wanted to do that little bit 2/2. It's not impossible. If that's what you want to do, I think you should feel free to stitch this on aida if you would prefer. I'm going to stitch it on the linen, but you know, you do what suits you. I use a magnifying glass and a light, even for a 32 count, let alone anything bigger. Even for a 16 count aida, to be honest, I usually have to use the magnifying glass. If you find linen too hard, or you just prefer to stitch on aida, absolutely you should go for it. And I think don't let this little bit with the signature put you off. You could just finish the sampler without it, but as I say, I also have some suggestions for how you might include your name and age and date, or indeed Carmen's name and age and date if you prefer, at the bottom. So that's what I'm using. And I ordered this, and I was quite keen to try stitching in some over-dyed floss. I have a pretty full set of anchor, not completely full, but a pretty full set of anchor threads that I bought secondhand from someone, sadly, who was having to give up stitching. So I made a palette from the anchor threads. I also, therefore, with the overdyed threads, I bought some classic colourwork threads, and I'll talk you through those in a minute, that are the overdyed threads. I was also really keen, and I know it's the super trendy thing and everybody's talking about it, but I really wanted to try stitching it with some sulky thread. So I have a sulky palette. And then finally, I have a DMC palette. I went to my local Hobbycraft and selected a DMC palette to try as well. Now, 4 palettes, 4, as you will see, not identical palettes. And I think that's a really important thing to say. Of course, you do not have to stick to my chosen palette, any one of these. You can substitute in any colours and threads you like. I think for the nature of the sampler it doesn't have any figurative elements. You could basically stitch this in any colourway you want. You don't even have to use, these all have 10 colours. But you could do it with fewer colours, you could do it in more colours, you could do it in really bright, vibrant, fluorescent colours, you could do it in really muted, dark, autumnal kind of colours. You could do it in any colours you want, and I think it would be absolutely beautiful. You know, it's just alphabets and geometric borders and numbers. So, you know, feel free to do it any way you want. As I say, my goal was to try and think about what colours Carmen might have used. And I started with the anchor threads. So you can see I've got a darker blue and a lighter blue, a darker green and a lighter green, darker pink and a lighter pink, darker sort of purple and a lighter purple, and then finally a sort of sunflowery warm yellow. 9 colours. I don't know why I thought it was 10. No, I knew there was 9. There are 9 colours in this pattern. There we go. And most of them, as far as I can see, are in these sorts of pairings. Blues, greens, pinks, something that I think may have been purple. It's quite hard to tell from the thing, and something that was certainly a yellowish tone. And those are bright, fresh colours is how I would describe those. And you can see I've stitched them on the fabric in cross stitch and then also in the 4-sided stitch, just to get a sense of how well they would stand out against the fabric background. The 4-sided stitch is an interesting one because it does use more thread, but it's sort of more spread out. So it doesn't always give quite such a contrast. It's almost as if the letters look a little bit blurred, I find, with it. It's not my favourite stitch, to be honest. Yeah, we'll talk about that again in a moment as well. But I did want to do that. I haven't done that with all the threads, but I did do that just as I was working out this first palette to see what sort of contrast would work well against the fabric tone. So those are those. Then I worked out, I was quite pleased with this. It's my little anchor to remind me of the anchor threads. This is my little sad face because these are the sulky threads. I liked that. Now, sulky threads. Initially, I bought the little packs you can get on Amazon and other places, and I bought 2 of those packs. They come with 6 in a pack, so there were 12. And I was like, I'm sure I'll be able to get a set out of those. And in the end, I couldn't because there were too many of them that were just too pale or too similar to use. I'd bought the Rosewood Manor set and the Rosewood something else set. And in the end, I went to the Sulky shop, and I wish I'd gone there first. That is what I'm going to link to below, because if you buy them from the Sulky shop directly, I think they are 90p per spool. So if you buy 6 spools, that is £5.40, which even with shipping added comes to about £8.40, which is less than the £10 I paid for the sets of 6 on Amazon. So even though they came with free shipping, they were still more expensive. So just go to the Sulky site and choose the ones you want. I sort of partly bought the kits because I thought, well, at least they will have been chosen to go well with each other. So yeah, so you can see I've still got 2 blues, 2 greens, 2 pinks, 2 purpley ones and a yellow, but they are different. They are different from the anchor ones. And what I would say to that is it's much more important that each set works as a palette on its own than that they represent the same palette altogether. I don't have a good way of doing that. But if you are thinking about creating your own palette, or even just substituting 1 or 2 of the colours within a palette, it's much more important that you consider, does this colour go with all the other colours I am actually using, than is it really close to the one colour I am substituting. For example, if you were to take this set of anchor threads and say, oh, well, I have got all of them, but I haven't got this blue at the top. Shall I have a look? Shall I substitute it with this DMC thread? Well, this DMC thread is really different, in fact. So you might say, well, maybe I can find a DMC thread that's really close to 161 in anchor, and I'm sure you could. But if that is close but a little bit greener, let's say, and then you find yourself substituting 261 and you find something but it's close but it's a little bit bluer, you may find that by the time you put your 2 substitutes together, they're too similar, or they're too different, or one of them just sticks out from all the rest because it's a warmer tone or a darker tone or a grayer tone. Do you see what I mean? It's not enough just to say, well, I've got one and this is quite close to it. Make sure you look at any substitutes with your whole palette together and make your choices with that in mind. So that is what I've tried to do, is to think about a whole palette and to have enough variation within the palette that it's lively and interesting to look at, but not so that any one colour stands out as being different from the pack. So I really enjoyed, by the way, stitching with the sulky threads. I know everybody says it, but actually it is really lovely. I used 2 strands of the anchor, I used 1 strand of the sulky, and it was a joy to stitch with. I really, really liked it. This is the Classic Colourworks. Now, although I have stitched these up, I think this is the set that is least true, because these are the over dyed, and so with just this little bit of stitching you don't get a sense of the variation. These numbers that I've stitched are smaller than the letters even in her small alphabet on here, so you would get within each sort of 2 letter set or each border, you would get a real sense of the variation that you don't get just from 2 or 3 numbers in this panel here. So I'm going to get out the actual threads and show you those together. Where have I put this? Here. So, oh, now they're all mixed up, and have I got the right ones in the right thing? I think it's this. Yes. Yes, so you may not know that the Classic Colourworks, they do have names, but they do also have numbers, which is why I've stitched the numbers. But I will tell you the names as well as the numbers, and I will show you them all together. So we have got, see if I can do it in the order that they are in the thing, that might be better. So we start with the darker blue. This is blue. Oh, I've got them all tangled up. Let's sort that out before we get any further. I think I carefully knotted them all together to keep them from tangling, and then there we go. If we just undo that. Right, so let's do this. I'm going to flip this up and show you. So this one is the darker blue, Blue Beatrice, beautiful sort of grey, purpley, smoke tinged blue. Really lovely. The next blue, I should have organised this much better. Blue Beatrice, Morning Glory. So a lighter blue, a slightly brighter blue, but I think they work quite nicely together in this set. That is number, all the best laid plans gone to pot. So Blue Beatrice was number 132. Morning Glory is number 206. Okay, what have we got next? We have got Chopped Chives. This is the darker of my greens, 217. So again, this is at the sort of slightly greyish muted end of the spectrum. None of these so far are massively variegated. They're all slightly variegated, but not excessively so. Then we've got a lighter green, which is Eve's Leaves. I really like that. That is number 139. I will list all of these below. Then the ones I most struggled with, which I was quite surprised with, was the sort of pinky purpley ones. So let me just see, make sure I've got these right. 227, which is Cherry Cobbler. 227. So that is a sort of darker, not quite a burgundy or maroon, but a sort of darker toned, it's definitely not cherry coloured. I don't really know why it's called Cherry Cobbler, because it's really not a cherry colour. It's much more orangey than pinky, but a nice dark one. And then to go with that, Crab Cakes, number 80, which feels very much like the sort of lighter tone of Cherry Cobbler. I don't know if that's coming across well on camera. Then we have got 85, Old Marigold. I really like this one. Now this is quite variegated, and you may or may not be able to see that. Some of it is quite pink. I'm going to come really close. Some of it is quite pink and some of it is quite orange. And it's the orange that I really wanted, but I think the pink will also be fine. I don't know if you can see the pink coming out on that at all. I'm not sure you can. Anyway, so there's that. And then there is 016 Grape Pie. So you can see in this set there's really only one violetty toned colour, and that is the Grape Pie. But that has got quite a lot of variegation in it. between the sort of paler and the darker. So I think that will come across anyway when you stitch it, that there will be darker and lighter tones. Now I'm dropping them. Apparently this is harder than it looks when people do this on Flosstube. Okay, let's get that. So that's Morning Glory. That's a Blue Beatrice. There is one more left, and it is Golden Star number 82. And again, this is a very variegated one between a bright yellow and a sort of orange yellow, and you can even see that on the screen actually. But I think that will be lovely. The orange is quite similar to the orange in Old Marigold. It's not identical, but quite similar, and I think that will work. So as a palette, the more I look at them, the more I think actually I really do like that. Some of them are the much more muted greyish end of the tone, like Blue Beatrice and the two greens, but actually there's some vibrancy in there as well, but not in a way that really jars. So I was going to stitch my sampler in the Classic Colourworks, and half of me is still tempted to do that, but I think I'm going to do it in the Sulky. But I'm really interested if anyone does choose to do that palette, because I think it would look really beautiful for this. So there are your Classic Colourworks, and then finally the DMC. And it was really interesting to me when I went to look at the DMC colours. I just couldn't find the kinds of colours I wanted in the sort of tone that I wanted. I ended up with a much darker palette, and I think you can see that pretty clearly on the camera. I like it still. I think some of these are actually even closer to possibly some of the ones that Carmen used. I'm not sure. And I think they work really well as a family together, but I wouldn't easily substitute the anchor for the DMC, for example. Think about it. If you're going to make substitutions, if you're going to make your own palette, do you think about the whole thing works together? So I will put all of those listed below, the numbers for the anchor, the Sulky, the Classic Colourworks and the DMC. And you can choose which of those you want to stitch or mix and match. I probably wouldn't mix and match the Sulky with the stranded floss, but otherwise have at it, do what you like. I would say actually when I was looking at Carmen's stitching, I haven't taken any of it apart and I'm not planning to, but there are parts where she's gone across. Let's get this really close here. Can you see that? Where she's gone from one stitch to another, and there's a fairly long strand of thread there, and so I've looked as carefully as I can at those strands, and I think, just gonna take my glasses off again, I think she was stitching with one strand of something. I don't think she was stitching with two strands of floss. I could be wrong, but that's my sense, is that it was one strand, which maybe then is more like the Sulky. But I mean, I think it would be completely fine to stitch this in two strands of floss, or if you're doing a very fine background fabric, one strand of floss would be absolutely fine. So that's fabric and that's flosses. Specialty stitches. So there are specialty stitches, as I mentioned. There are eyelets and there are four-sided stitches. I thought there was some satin stitch, but I now can't see any. So I may have got confused with another sampler that I've been looking at. You could stitch this sampler without doing any specialty stitches. I will just throw that out there right now. You could replace all of the four-sided stitches with single cross stitch. You could replace all of the eyelets with a sort of 4x4 cross stitch. Or if you wanted to, if you're going to do that, you could even smooth out the larger alphabet, and that would be absolutely fine. It would look lovely. I think the only reason why you might want to just think twice about doing that is the four-sided stitch alphabet is not identical to, but very, very close to the cross-stitch alphabet that you do at the beginning. So you would effectively be doing the same alphabet more or less twice. Not absolutely identically. The four-sided stitch one is a little bit simpler, but it's very, very close. Most of the letters are identical. There's just one or two places where it's a bit different. So you might choose not to do that. This four-sided stitch alphabet is two quite neat rows. There's a little border between them, but it is all of that row and all of that row. Yeah, all of this row and all of this row, and there is this little border between them. You could easily do it and just chop that whole section out, or you could rechart it if you wanted to, because there is no motto, no text on this. So that might be where you think, actually, I'd like to see something fun there. I could chart up a phrase that I want to use, or use some motifs that I want to put something else in there and cross stitch those, or you could cross stitch the alphabet if you wanted. The eyelet stitch, it is the same alphabet but bigger. So actually I think it would work quite well if you cross stitched that and you had that version of the bigger one. So I don't think there's any reason, if you're really object to specialty stitches, to think I can't do this sampler. You might just want to think about what you want to do with that alphabet, but you could absolutely just do it as charted with the specialty stitches. What about this section here, right at the bottom? Carmen M. Louche, age 9 year. Yeah, where it's unfinished. What are we going to do there? Of course, you could stitch it exactly as it is, and I will give you the chart for that. Carmen M. Louche, age 9 year, and you can stop there. You could do that, and you could put your own name over here, or your initials, or the date over here. You could replace the whole thing with your name, age, year, location, and I will give you the alphabet charted based on Carmen's own alphabet for that. One thing I think it would be quite fun to do would be to include a quote or a saying, and I've got a couple of ideas for that. I'm not going to tell you now, I'm going to wait until I've stitched them up and the chart is released, but I've got a couple of ideas of things that would really fit with what we know about the sampler and the stitcher, and would fit quite nicely in that little space at the bottom. So you could do that. The other thing you could do, of course, and I mentioned this earlier, is I am going to chart up a way of doing that. It will be a little bit deeper, but only by about 1/2 inch. It will still give the impression of being a square sampler, and do a 2/2 alphabet based on Carmen's alphabet up here, and stitch name and date there. So there are a number of things you could do there, which again, you can avoid doing the 1/1 if you just don't want to do it, or if you want to stitch it on Aida, you will be able to do that really satisfactorily. So threads, fabric, specialty stitches, plans. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the schedule I'm aiming for on stitching and releasing this chart, and then I'm going to talk about the history of the sampler itself. So if you're not really interested in that, obviously you don't have to watch that. As I say, I'm going to plan to start stitching this quite soon. I'm not sure that I will get the whole thing done in December, but what I plan to do is start releasing the sections on January the 1st, and probably it will be every 2 weeks. So you'll get this first section down to the swirly border on January the 1st, then from the lowercase alphabet down to the end of the 4-sided stitch alphabet on January the 15th. Then you'll get the eyelet stitch alphabet on January the 29th, and then you'll get the final section, including all the charts and ideas for what you might do in the unfinished bit, 2 weeks after that, February the something. So if you wanted to stitch along with it, you could easily be finished by the end of February. If you want to wait till it's all released, obviously you can do that. You can stitch it whenever you like. I'm going to stitch it and release little glimpses of my stitching as I go through, so you can see what the finished thing might look like before I release the pattern. And I'm going to use the hashtag Carmen SAL. Carmen as her name, CARMEN SAL, stitch along. So this is the Carmen SAL. It is a free sampler stitch along for 2022. I would love you to join me. I'd love you to let people know about it. If you're on Instagram, use the hashtag. If you're on YouTube and you want to mention it in your Flosstube video, I would love you to do that. Yeah, it's just for fun. I am not a designer. This is not for profit. It is a charted reproduction of Carmen's sampler with some suggestions of how you might update it for modern stitching. All the suggested fabrics and flosses will be listed in the description below here, but also I'll put a link to my blog where it will all be on the blog post if ever you want to refer to that. And that's also where I will be releasing the actual PDFs for the chart. It'll also be all on my Instagram as well, the photos, links and so on. The first piece, as I say, I'm going to aim to have that come out on January the 1st. So if you wanted to do it as your new year, new start, you certainly could, because you'll have all the information about what you'll need to kit it up beforehand, and you'll have seen photos of my stitching of it beforehand to give you an idea if this is something you're interested in doing. Please do let me know if I've forgotten anything. If there's any other questions you have about the sampler or about the stitch along, about thread choices or fabric choices, about how you'll be able to get hold of the sampler charts when you want them. At the moment I'm thinking about just releasing them in colour, you know, with the thing on top, but if people would prefer also to have a black and white version with just the symbols, let me know and I'll be able to do that. Also, I'm still slightly trying to work out the best way of charting for the four-sided stitch and the eyelet stitch. So if anyone has any brilliant ideas about how you can do that, do let me know sooner rather than later. So I think that's all I have to say about stitching it and the stitch along, but I did want to talk a little bit about the sampler itself. I haven't had this sampler that long. I've had it, I don't know, 6 months or so. I bought it on Etsy. I really liked it. It came in a pack actually with another unfinished sampler that's much more unfinished and quite a different sort of thing. But I really like Carmen's. As I say, when it first arrived, I almost thought it was finished. I was like, what's not finished? But you can see right at the bottom, aged 9 YEA. So normally I would expect if they were abbreviating it, it would say YRS or YR, years. But I think finishing it there halfway through the words feels to me like she meant to finish the word. And also because the sampler is so densely stitched, you know, there is not a space on it for anything else other than here at the bottom. I think our Carmen planned to fill that in. I just do. I think she planned to fill it in aged 9 years, date, place. That would be my guess. I just can't see that she wanted to leave any of this blank. So I think it is unfinished. It is a bit frustratingly unfinished because although we know how old Carmen was, we don't know what year it was stitched in. We can't date it very easily. So I did start to do a bit of research. It's quite an unusual name, at least in the UK. So I bought the sampler in the UK, and for various reasons I'll talk to you about in a minute, I do think it is a UK sampler. But when you put Carmen's name into ancestry.co.uk, you get no results at all. No birth records, no death records, no marriage records, no census records, nothing. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? You get nothing. So what might that mean? Well, there's a number of things it might mean. It might mean it's not a UK sampler after all, and that is possible, and I will come back to that in a moment. It might mean that it's a very early sampler, that Carmen lived before census records, and that although there should have been birth records, possibly, you know, there were written records, sometimes fires burned down, sometimes things got destroyed and lost. Possibly it just got lost. Census records in the UK are reliably available from 1811. So if she were born, I don't know, 1800, stitch this in 1809 when she was 9, she might not have been in the 1811 census. Why might she not have been in the 1811 census? Well, she might have died. It's really hard, isn't it, to think about that. But actually, she might have done. At 9 years old, in the early 19th century, she might have died. She might have emigrated. Let's say that. That's also possible, although, you know, slightly unusual. Not impossible. I mean, you know, England was at war at that point in the early 19th century, but our navy was pretty dominant. People were emigrating. They were emigrating to India. Sometimes they were emigrating to the Americas. Sometimes, although less often, back to Europe. let's think about Carmen and where, well, no, let's carry on thinking about what the circumstances are why we might not have a record of her. So that is possible. She might have been before census records and her birth record might not have survived. It's also possible, isn't it, that she was born outside of the UK and then immigrated either before census records were taken or between censuses. So she might have been born in Europe, moved here when she was an infant, stitched this sampler here in the UK, and then again either died or left before the next census. That would explain why there would be no birth record for her, and that could have happened at any time. She's 9, so we know there's time in the gap, the 10-year gap between censuses, for her to have arrived in this country, stitched the sampler, left again. She might have done that. She might yeah, so records might have been lost. She might have been immigrating. It might have been between censuses. It might have been before census records began. Why do I think this is a UK sampler? Well, as I say, there's very little on here other than alphabets, but what there is in English, aged 9 years. So although Carmen M. Luche suggests that she is probably of Spanish origin or possibly Italian, or some other South European, but most likely Spanish, she was stitching her sampler in English. So I do not think that she was a Spanish girl born in Spain stitching a Spanish sampler. Why on earth would she have written it in English if that were the case? Where were we fighting a war at that time? Well, we were fighting on the Eastern Front in Russia and the Baltic, I think. At that time, my date is not absolutely clear about precisely the Napoleonic campaign, but we were certainly fighting in Spain and Portugal. It's not impossible that there was interaction between British soldiers and Spanish natives and Spanish soldiers and British civilians while we were fighting the Peninsular Wars. It is not impossible, for example, that Carmen might have had Spanish parents, one of whom maybe her father was killed in the wars, her mother remarried an Englishman, and she ended up in England. We don't know. We don't know anything about Carmen. I am trying to think of possible scenarios why this girl with this very Spanish name is writing an English sampler. If she's doing it in the early 19th century, the Peninsular Wars is one explanation that might indicate why she's ended up over here and is doing this. There is another possibility, and the other possibility that I think we should give consideration to is that it might not be an English sampler at all. It might be an American sampler. So if you look up the records in the American genealogy websites, this is a name that appears much more frequently in the immigration records, and also then later in marriage and birth records and so on. It is possible that Carmen either emigrated herself to Spain or from Spain to America, or her parents had done so and she grew up in America and that's why she was stitching in English. There are a couple of reasons why I think that's not the most likely explanation, although it is certainly possible. First is the style of the sampler itself. It's really hard to put my finger on this, but to me that looks like an English sampler. It just has the hallmarks of an English sampler to me. It's very functional, it's alphabets and borders, it's not decorative at all. I don't think you see samplers like this typically in America. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on these things. I've done some research and I have some experience looking at these things. To me, this looks like an English schoolroom sampler that you've made because your governess has told you to. Could be wrong. I don't think it's an orphanage sampler, mostly just because of the multiplicity of colours that she's been allowed to use, as if she's basically picked them at random. And again, I could be wrong on that, but to me it looks like this is someone who's relatively well off with a governess making her sit and stitch a sampler in England. The other reason I think it's less likely to be America is to do with one of the alphabets. If you look at that lowercase alphabet here, I wonder if you notice a strange letter in there. Did you notice this letter? Between the R and the S, there is a long S. Now, that is a really interesting letter that Carmen has included here. The long S was very commonly in use in the 18th century, and I mean before that in the 17th century as well. I don't think this is a 17th century sampler. In the 18th century, that letter was very commonly in use in handwritten English and also printed English. In America, it disappears pretty quickly in both handwritten and printed English. You don't see it much in the 19th century. In England, it persists. It drops out of typewritten English in about 1850, but even after that, people are using it in their own handwritten English. I think that letter indicates to me that this is much more likely to be an English sampler than an American one. Again, it's not a dead set. We don't know any of this. All I'm trying to do is look at the various bits of evidence there are and put them together and come up with likely or less likely scenarios. And to me, an English sampler seems a more likely scenario. The style of the sampler, the inclusion of that letter, the English writing at the bottom. Yeah, it just, when I looked at it, and I bought it, that's the other thing, is I bought it in the UK. Now, of course, it's not impossible that it's travelled back from America to the UK at some point, or travelled from, not back from. But it's not the kind of sampler you'd expect there to be much trade in. It's not finished, it's not in great condition, it's never been framed. It's not like somebody would have thought, oh, that's a beautiful piece of art, I must keep that to have that on my wall. If it were a personal piece, then yes, I could see you might bring that back if that was Great Granny's sampler. But even now, this is a really, really uncommon name in the UK, this surname Luce. You know, I mean, maybe she had, you know, descendants may have had British links and that's why it came back. But there's nothing about this other than the name that is making me think it's American. And so then I think we're left wondering, well, how significant is that evidence of the name? It is more likely to be American, but it is not impossible, despite the lack of any record with that name, that this was stitched in England. She could have been born in England and her birth record disappeared. She could have moved to England in childhood and stitched this before a census record was taken with her name on it. And I just wonder if the unfinishedness of it, yes, it could have been stitched and they were about to emigrate and it got left behind. Of course it could. But it's a pretty precious thing. You spent a lot of time on it. Maybe she hated it. I don't get the impression she hated it. I get the impression she was having fun with it. You might have left it behind. You might have left it behind by mistake. You might have given it to your governess as a keepsake. You might have been in such a hurry that you couldn't finish it and you left it behind. I don't know. I just have a suspicion. I have no evidence for it at all. I think she died before she could finish it. I really do. And it's just such an odd place to stop, so near the end. Even if you were going to America, you'd need your sampler to say, look, this is what I can do. I know my letters, I know my stitching. Why would you leave it behind? So anyway, whatever, it's true to say that Carmen is no longer alive now, but I just think that may possibly. So we don't have a date. My sense is this is quite an old sampler. It is stitched on linen with linen, I think. I don't think it's silk, and I'm pretty sure it's not cotton. I think it's linen on linen. It's quite fine. It's got the early letter, the long S. My guess would be late 18th, early 19th century, maybe 1780 to 1820, something like that. I'm not an expert. I might be missing something really obvious in terms of the materials or the letters or the evidence for it. I don't think this is late 19th century. I don't think this is 1880. I think it's earlier than that. I certainly don't think it's early 17th century, early 18th century, where samplers still were much more figurative. It's functional, but it's, yeah, I just, that's my instinct. I'm going to say late 18th, early 19th century. I think it's lovely. I think it's really lovely. I do think she enjoyed it, and I think I'm going to enjoy stitching it too. And I hope you might stitch it along with me and that you will enjoy it as well. So do let me know. If you are somebody, I don't have paid access. Well, I don't have paid access. I got a 3 months trial to ancestry.co.uk, and I did my best to look her up and drew a blank. I was able to see that there were records for people with names with the same or similar names in the US. If you have ancestry.com in the US or a similar thing, and you'd like to look up Carmen M. Luche, Luche, and see what you can come up with, I would be really interested to know if you can trace down someone who this might be or might be related to. Yeah, it would be really interesting to know if we can pin down any more than that. It's hard, isn't it, when there's no date at all, there's just a name and an age. But I hope Carmen would be glad that her sampler has survived and that we are going to resurrect it for a new generation. Carmen SAL. Do follow me here if you're not already subscribed to my channel, and click the notification bell if you'd like updates. Like I say, my normal videos are a whole wide range of craft which you may or may not be interested in, but the ones that are going to be for the sampler and cross stitch specific, they will be on a separate playlist that will be my Flosstube playlist. Do follow me over on Instagram as well. Do leave a comment if you've got any questions, if you're thinking about stitching along, or if you know anything about Carmen. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.